Thank you very much. My presentation will be a continuation of Thomas Aquinas' perspective. So, Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, uttered the sentence which for many medieval thinkers served a pattern to define the human being. Nevertheless, this is not a question of giving a specific qualitative definition, which explains human as rational being, but it would rather be to emphasize a primary and paramount feature which human possesses and which makes him an intellectual being. Homo in quantum homo solus est intellectus, right, Aristotle in Latin. The thinker who especially was found on the above statement was Albert the Great. For him it was just intellect that made a human itself, and it was the intellect that made a human similar to God. What is interesting, Aquinas hardly ever made any comments to his masters regarding that issue. There are no remarks neither in his comments to ethics, nor in his own research on understanding of a human being and his soul. Regarding Aristotle, Thomas only sustained the sentence that intellect is the principle which makes human everything which is assigned to it. The intellect makes humans will a free will, humans love a true love. Aquinas would later say, homo est praecipua id quod est secundum intellectum et rationem, noticing that the intellect is for human being something formal and that what gives complexity rather than is identical with the whole human as such. Aquinas was far from considering human being as identical with soul, and he never explicitly said that human is an intellect. One may ask then how to refer to the soul and intellect relation, especially where the soul is understood as a form of body, and intellect is a power which operates without any corporal organ. And what is the point here is not only an issue of simple explanation that intellect is the power of human being, but also whether understanding intellect as a power, which is immaterial part of human being, is not contradictory to the statements on the unity of being, as we refer to human being in terms of subsistence. Whether, the second question, whether intellect is a part of human being or is spoken of on the whole of human being. The third, whether it is possible to say that human intellect is a human form. What follows in presentation is confirmation of a typical for Thomas Adagium. It is an error to say that mind or intellect gets knowledge, but is human himself who cognize through them. The first point of my presentation is soul as a hoca liquid versus intellect. Definition of soul as a substantial form of human being is one of the most recognizable anthropological statements of Aquinas. Such a definition imposed on soul allowed this medieval author to render essential identity for human being. For the acceptance of Platonic understanding of soul as a factor activating motor, implied the thesis, hardly to be accepted, that unification, which is the unity of body and soul, is being accomplished only by activity. In turn, the acceptance of existence of indirect elements, media, between rational soul and the first matter joined with a form in a human being, implied multiplicity of forms or infinite number of connectors. By the way, Aquinas was convinced that the latter statement was a consequence of Platonic views as well. The very statement that soul is a form would be insufficient when its soul's immateriality and corruptibility, and in consequence the immortality and corruptibility is considered. One could easily notice that also the phrase soul is a form barely explains what the intellect in it actually is. We need to add a few remarks regarding the explanation of soul's mode of existence as an individual being and subsistence to show its relation to the intellect fully. When Thomas refers to soul terms of hoca liquid, he also adds that the term subsistentia. He showed two meanings of hoca liquid. The first, that what is not in anything else as in subject, that is, it exists independently, that refers to any separate subsisting being. The second meaning, that what is complete, so it is being existing independently when it comes to genus and species, that refers straightforward to that what possesses all parts of which the whole is consisted. On the first understanding, this concrete being, all accidents are excluded and any form which are not substantial. The second understanding, however, excludes a rational soul itself, because hoca liquid is supposed to cover a definition of human being as thinking animal possessing both soul and body. We may assume that rational soul, regarded as soul itself, is only a part of Spetz's definition of human being, and consequently, for this reason, it cannot be considered in terms of the second understanding of this particular being. Hence, the existing compositum should be referred to as a subsistence. What is obvious, soul as a part is the concrete subsisting being, so it is able to exist independently. However, in that case, we refer to soul in the first terms of hoc aliquid. Soul cannot take part in fullness of human species to accomplish its nature. When united with body, soul makes human being fulfilled in its genus, but when exists separately, is unable to do so. In our analysis, it is reasonable to turn our attention to the intellect, leaving materiality aside, as this is accurately the way Thomas used to proceed. When he stated the soul is a subsistence and its immaterial, he refers to nothing else but intellect. For it is intellect and its immateriality activity that is the obvious implication of Thomas' arguments for spiritual aspect of soul joining to body. What is interesting, his arguments had to be grounded in a terror of two intellects operating within human being, the agent and possible intellect. Aforementioned arguments for spirituality of soul appear in a few places of Aquinas' text and is sometimes called impediment argument, argument for plasticity of intellect, argument from common dimension. The names differ, as Thomas himself did not establish any name for his reasoning in this matter. There is no doubt the argument derives from the Aristotelian tractate on the soul, however, it is not developed by Aquinas. The argument is present in four places, and its most important presumption would be summarized as follows. The first, man cognises the nature of all bodies by his own intellect. The second promises that what is able to cognize everything cannot in itself have a nature of the cognized object. The nature of body would blockade a process of cognition. The third, it is impossible for the intellectual principle to be a body. It would not be possible for the principle for intellectual action to act through a bodily part. The fourth, the intellectual principle, which is called the intellect or the mind, acts per se. There is no bodily involvement in its action. Hence, according to Aquinas, a soul is something subsisting with regard to actions which are not the acts of body. However, this statement is disturbingly mistaken. In summa, nevertheless, Thomas develops the issue further. In response to some objection, he would emphasize that known of parts, as far as understood a part of a whole, could not exist separately and act separately, neither soul or body, as well as an eye or a hand. This is for the fact that soul is something subsisting for the est and inherited in matter, qua liquid aliud est. Aquinas tries to explain status of soul significantly. Nevertheless, he used to leave some question open to make analysis on a whole human being possible, including body, for which soul serves a form. Through the intellect, thus, we would observe a unique characteristic of human soul as a rational being. So the second point of presentation, soul as a form united with body versus intellect. On the ground of what has been already said, one may object when it comes to the very unity of soul and body in human being. If one assumed that their unity, then one could not escape the assumption that they are the one thing. This is for the fact of what has been already stated above, that human being is complete substance and exists independently, where his parts, even considered separately, would never be complete substances. Doubts we may find in Summa in question 76, article 1st. Exemplifies problems Aquinas coped with the employed categories of form and matter to explain the conjoinment of soul to body. The issue or paramount importance because they put the question whether intellect can conjoin to body in human being. We have probably noticed that intellect operates outside body, so as outside, its existing is. Additionally, so as subsisting, with what means of independent existence, can serve as a form from body. So assures that through what a thing what it is, and for that it has to possess its own principle of existence. Arguments against understanding soul in terms of form of body appeal to incompatibility of intellectual cognition and materiality. If that were true, form and matter union of intellect and body, it would make intellectual activity impossible. We should remember, moreover, that soul exists even after body is decomposed. If one does not accept that intellectual soul is a form of body, one would have to accept the absurd. This implication is a key argument for Thomas. One supposed to answer the question, what makes intellectual cognition just mine as such? As Bob Pasnow, Robert Pasnow puts it, what join us to our intellect? Thomas in Somatology even mentions a kind of our own experience to convince us about that. But if anyone says that the intellectual soul is not the form of the body, he must first explain how it is that this action of understanding is the action of this particular man. For each one is conscious that it is himself who understands. The end of citation. Similar, the text we find in Commentary on the Soul. For it is clear that the actually intelligent being is this particular man. However, Denis, this implies that he himself understands nothing, and therefore that one need pay no attention to what he says. But if he does understand anything, he must do so in virtue of some principle in him of this particular activity of understanding. The question, what makes my intellectual activity just mine, would be easily answered from the Platonic position, of course, and Augustinian, according to which human being is a soul that uses the body. This view posits a concrete man in a position of concrete intellect, having intellectual cognitive abilities, recepting sensual experience through characteristic of its own soul. Moreover, it is the intellect which can cognize itself more easily than its own body. Even this proposal is prone to be smoothly accepted. It contradicts the fact that the whole man cognizes while his parts are united in one cognizing wholeness. That is one and the same man who is conscious both that he understands and that he senses. But one cannot sense without the body. Therefore, the body must be some part of man. It follows, therefore, that the intellect by which Socrates understands is a part of Socrates, so that in some way it is united to the body of Socrates. Somatology consists Aquinas' own answer to the question of soul-body relation, and what is clearly emphasized is the human form is a principle of his intellectual act. It means that intellect is already to the very fact of establishing human essence itself. Human is referred as a caused by form. Nevertheless, intellect is not identical with soul itself. Thomas gives three arguments for including intellect in form. They are, of course, in their essence, the quintessence of helomorphism. The first, man is able to cognize intellectually, for there is a principium of it inherent in him, which is the substantial form. We can describe form in terms of species perspective. The nature of something is related to its activity. When it comes to man, its significant distinctive feature is his intellectual cognition. In the third, among forms joined to matter, human form is the most perfect with regard to incorporeal, immaterial activity. Human form is the nature immersed, nor comprehended in body. Additional argument for such a unity emphasis the absence of composition of form and matter in a soul itself. If that were so, the whole would not serve a form for any lower matter. In summa, Aquinas pointed out with the regard to impediment argument that in soul it would be impossible to exist both form and matter. He says, for in the intellectual soul were composed of matter and form, the forms of things would be received into its as individuals, and so it would only know the individual, just as it happens with the sensitive powers which receive forms in corporeal organ. We may add that soul, in terms of form, is an act of body as well. It is soul which makes essential principium and which actualizes potentiality of being, which is body. When human intellect is considered, we notice K factor that intellect not always is an act through the object, so not always cognized. Aquinas often says about possible intellect that a man is found sometimes to be actually understanding and sometimes and only potentially. This remark in his further reading sounds slightly different when the very act of human intellect approaching from one act of cognition to the other is emphasized. Every intellect, furthermore, that understands one thing after the other is at one time potentially understanding and at another time actually understanding. The third part of my presentation, part relation versus intellect. Where is intellect, of course? This is the question in one of my finger, probably. Aquinas often refers to whole part categories, regarding them further to metaphysical reflection in general. When applied to psychological issues, they are helpful to solve the problem whether soul is whole in each part of body. The very understanding of soul as a form of body, which is actually its act, means that soul by itself is the first act of body, and it's inherent in particular parts for the assignment to the whole. The fact that a form organizes particularly yet different parts of body is possible, as their activities differ as well. What is interesting, Aquinas clearly states that soul conjoins different parts integrally, and the same gains greater perfection. The implication is simple. It looks like the more complicated body, the more great soul have. Obviously, the problem of whole part as correlators suppose to be found as one of the most crucial for metaphysics, for it predicates being with regard to its whole content, the whole structure of being. The most crucial analysis on the whole-part relation we may find mainly in Aquinas' De Spiritualibus Creaturis. However, similar approach is also present in his other text. The question is soul wholly in each part of body? What actually could be posed as the question whether intellect is in any particular part of body, it is in a finger. To answer this question, Thomas starts with pointing out three kinds of wholeness: on quantity, on essence, on power. According to how the wholeness is understood, we can speak about possibilities of soul present in body. The first understanding cannot be ascribed to any soul in its full meaning, surely not to a rational soul. Something is possible to be divided into particular amount of parts, and we can say that one form is everywhere, whiteness is on white wall. This is because matter, even fragmented, is similar in wholeness as well as in parts. Whiteness is present accidentally. The second, wholeness, takes into consideration all essential elements which represent its perfection. In the Spiritualibus Creaturis, Aquinas gives three examples of such unwholeness. In physical being, composition of form and matter assures perfection. Obviously, it is because of form. In logical order, a perfect wholeness exists when genus and species are described and its differences in terms of definition. When it comes to accident forms against substantial ones, wholeness has its levels more or less. The last of wholeness has consisted of power in its fullest to accomplish it takes in particular parts. According to parts, the power can operate differently. And if two later distinctions were referred to soul and body and powers of soul to body, one should accept their mutual dependence. The third distinctive quantitative is of no use because soul is neither quantitative wholeness nor occupies in any place. The dependence is the result of the fact that body as wholeness is being made perfect indirectly, but particular parts are being perfected as far as they act accordingly to this wholeness. It means that, the first, soul is wholly in each part of body in terms of second understanding whole-part relation, which says that soul is both a form and act for wholeness in each part. And the second, soul is wholly in each part of body according to the third understanding of whole part, that is, not all of the powers are in particular parts of body. Such a solution, according to Aquinas, allows to admit the existence in soul such a domain of powers which do not belong to any particular part of body, and also to show that particular powers are conjoined to the particular organs, and finally to establish hierarchy of importance for parts of body. The more important is power, the more important part of body is, or better, serves other power. We conclude that from the fact that particular parts of body are unique in their excellence with a few of their activities. However, at first we find only marks on the whether soul is wholly in a whole body. We can find much more in this text, for it is the answer to the question why homo non est intellectus included. If intellect were an act of body, moreover, of each single part of it, if intellect were indeed identical with the form, it would conjoin to body through relation some of form-matter relation. On the other hand, if form is a source of activity of being and as power is present in its part, one would not say that soul is wholly in the whole in the third weight of wholes present in parts. Soul is wholly present in a whole for perfection of the essential part, but when its role as a principle of activity is concerned, it is not wholly included in a whole human being. The third point, In what sense intellect is a form of human being? Aquinas, in many of his works, speaks about intellect as the form of human being. If it really were an act of body, it would make the earlier my analysis mistaken, that what is more the sentence homo est intellectus would appear absolutely justified. Human being then would be an intellect establishing not only human essence, but at the same the unity of human being. Such statements need to be explained, especially in the context of relation between soul and its powers. Obvious as it seems, the statement that essence of soul is not its powers would be then in this particular point questioned. As Weber noticed that while dealing with Seeger's from Brabant interpretation of intellect during the Second Paris Regency, the change arose. Aquinas never mentioned the issue of soul and its power identity. Suffice to say that he did not change his mind on a soul-powers relation, which is soul-intellect relation. I think that Weber is wrong. To eventually find the answer, we need to analyze some utterance in the Veritate, particularly in the question on mind, question 10. Aquinas clearly suggests that intellect is the power of human soul, considering whether Augustinian categories of mind, memory, intelligence, and will, well-being, imago Dei, or possible to adopt Aristotelian categories. And for it is the highest power, the name intellect, could be applied to soul and be identical with it. The word mind is applied to the soul in the same way as understanding is, since however, the essence of things are not known to us, and their powers reveal themselves to us through their acts. We often use the names of the faculties and powers to denote the essence. Aquinas would assert identity of intellect and intellectual soul, however, only on the condition that we can say soul is an intellect, to understand soul as a having possessed the highest power which characterizes it. But soul is not an intellect in terms of being identical and impossible to be differentiated from intellect. Aquinas, in his sentences, which unifying soul as a form with intellect, probably aimed to point out the essentially. Formally, in human being, we find a principle of intellectual activities. And if we embrace that the soul is the principle of intellectual activities and of factor, essence, and acts, then we need to employ the result to the intellect. And it is not for other reason that for Seeger's from Brabant views and his grumbling on the side proponents, both employing vis cogitativa, a function which determines human species, and separating possible intellect from individual man, provoked Aquinas to formulate his statements on soul and body relation, emphasizing their separate character and also pointing out their causative relation as well. In Contra Gentiles, Aquinas formulating arguments to Averroes and I think to Avicenna that vis cogitativa is not the function which determines human species. The last point, necessity to admit the area of intellectual potentiality in human soul. Aquinas' conception on soul, body, and intellect relation is of philosophical character. It may be an alternative for Platonic, Augustine, and Cartesian explanatory model. Aquinas developed Aristotle's achievements and modified them further. Some changes are essential and fundamental, as Thomas referred to peripatetic tradition to understand Aristotle better. Modifications were of paramount importance also with regard to the Augustinian position, which influenced medieval theological thought significantly. To what has been already said, we may add some remarks of Professor Gogacz, he is the Polish Thomist, on intellective potentiality. They properly explained how to understand, introduced by Thomas, the need for posing a domain and a form which would be responsible for any intellectual activity or operation, and which would be solid reason, apart from matter susceptible for quantitative measure, for establishing the individuality of human being. Aquinas does not speak straightforward, however. When one begins with the same starting points, one would come to the conclusion Gogacz made. When one speaks of intellect as potential domain, one says a human is not an intellect, and moreover, one does so on the basis of the overall view Aquinas had on reality. That is the view from the perspective of the being as se, the first act of being, as the very first act of the well-being. When one speaks about two intellects, it is necessary to turn our attention to act potentiality relation. Act is limited by potentiality and it signifies the one. Potentiality with regard to an act makes occasionality possible, makes an act imperfect. However, it exists along with an act, penetrating it and making its ontic foundation thinner. Intellect as a potentiality of soul diminishes in it imperfect, but it's not only body that diminishes soul. On the other hand, we should remember that intellect is potentiality of soul. It is obviously necessary accident, manifesting reasonability of soul, but also it is something that modifies soul significantly. It is a tool of cognition and the condition of greater principle of its individuality. If the intellect were not a soul, it would be outside of a soul because it differs from its nature as an act. If we said that intellect is a potentiality, it would be dependent soul in its existence. Hence, it would not possess its own existence apart from composition, only existence depend on. These remarks may result in a danger of emphasizing cognitive character of existence of intellect. In the result, the hypostasis. Even if the intellect, active and possible, is different from soul, its being outside signifies being potentiality, being a structural factor of soul. Soul, however, is an act and signifies itself through potentiality, where it would be the most reasonable to say that soul is a form consisted of domain of act of body and intellectual potentiality, which are intellectual powers. Additionally, with the problem of intellectual potentiality, the problem of individuality of human being arises. The element which is crucial for individualization implies from the nature of intellect itself as a potentiality of soul. And there is much more included in it than only matter. Gogach puts it, potentiality with perfect existence is essential, signifies occasionality of being and its separateness. Potentiality which makes matter imperfect makes being an individual one within its species. The above solution is a proposal to answer the question posed even by Gogach, how it is possible to accept both accidental and potential character of the intellect. Any proposals which separated intellect from soul were about impossibility for both active and possible intellect to be the powers of soul. If, however, they were powers, one would not say that human is an intellect, a mind, consciousness, or a reason. For there is not only different semantical content in this word, but they denote various concepts of human being as such. Thank you for your attention.